I'm Andre Vltchek, and I'm Russian, originally born in Russia, Czech American, whatever, cosmopolitan, global internationalist, journalist and writer and filmmaker. And I don't know, I mean, when did I get into journalism? Long time ago, in Peru during the civil war there in the so-called Dirty War in 1992 between the government of Fujimori and shining Maoist shining path.
So what were you doing in Peru there? I mean, tell us a bit about that conflict. It's almost been forgotten about.
I was trying to get killed. No. I mean, I was so disgusted with New York that I had to leave. And I went there. I was working for several media outlets. I don't want to name them because I feel embarrassed that I worked for them because they were mainstream. And actually, the conflict was really terrible because there were two, one Marxist and one Maoist guerrilla groups fighting the absolutely corrupt and defunct Peruvian state at the time under the presidency of Alberto Fujimori, who was Peruvian of Japanese descent. And it was a very brutal conflict because there was people, the villagers, they were suffering. They were totally brainwashed by the government. They were brainwashed to hate everything Marxist. So, of course, while the Shining Path was also a very brutal guerrilla movement, the MRTA, the Marxist one, was kind of much more moderate and probably we could even call it more or less progressive. They were between two fires, between the government and Maoist Shining Path. So it was a total mess. There was a masquerade game going on between the government troops and the Shining Path. The Shining Path would kill the soldiers. They would put on the uniforms of the military, and military was doing the same with the uniforms of the Shining Path, and they would, soldiers would kidnap, stop the bus in the mountains, and they would enter and shout, "Viva la Cumpa!" and everybody would say, "Viva!" and then they would arrest everybody because obviously they were, in their eyes, they were supporting the...
So were the Americans involved in this conflict remotely, as they seem to be quite a lot in South America?
They were involved in that conflict, and then later they were, of course, also involved in 1996 when the MRTA movement took over the residency of the Japanese ambassador. And there I was working for Asahi Shimbun, for the biggest Japanese newspaper. And that was actually a very complex conflict because the MRTA took hostages. They were treating them very well. They were learning Japanese. Japanese staff was learning Spanish. They were playing football, and they were all massacred by the special commandos. And there the U.S. was involved. They were sending satellite images. They were even using, they were identifying the bodies of guerrilla fighters inside of the embassy using some satellite technology based on heat and I don't know, very complex stuff. There, of course, they were involved a lot, but also in the Civil War that was taking place in 1980s and beginning of 1990s.
I mean, many of us think that the United States government, special forces, etc., have been involved in South American politics pretty much since, for a long, long time, and very enthusiastically since the Second World War. How are there any signs of hope that South American countries are actually able to be self-governing rather than being controlled effectively by the Pentagon, by Washington?
Self-governing they can be, but the question is that whether they will be allowed to be. Look, I was in just half a year ago, I was writing my novel I was working on my latest novel in Buenos Aires, and of course, you know what happened in Argentina, basically with the Macri elections of the neoliberals and Macri government. And then I was there exactly at the time when Dilma Rousseff was going through this horrible, bizarre impeachment process in neighboring Brazil. So it's actually, it's something that is unavoidable, that the West and United States in particular in that part of the world is sponsoring all sorts of opposition movements, works with the most vicious and vile opposition figures, like in Brazil, like in Argentina, and everywhere. There's this new game that is called corruption scandals. I mean, whatever government is from the left, there is immediately some skeleton in a closet that is being pulled out and highlighted and all this. And, imagine that these countries were living for decades under the right-wing dictatorship sponsored by the West. So, of course, there is always some corruption, or somebody is always somehow a little bit corrupt, or somebody is connected. There cannot be anything clear, 100% clear in any of the societies that went through such a horrible trauma of real moral corruption and destruction and mass murder and rapes that were taking place under the right-wing dictatorships. So every little thing is blown out of proportions and held against the governments that are trying to stand on their feet, and then the media says, and the so-called opposition in these countries says, oh, you see, so everybody is the same. They're the same. This government is the same as the previous one. And I was like, no, I mean, how can you compare, let's say, 20 or 30,000 people who were disappeared and tortured and murdered to, some embezzlement by a minor minister of, $500,000. But they compare these things. They put them on the same level. It's the same like, UK media and propaganda is dealing with China. It's the same philosophy. Let's say in Zambia there is some minor mining disaster, and in a mine that is owned by a Chinese company, and let's say 20 people die because of negligence. And it is terrible, but it's negligence. It's nothing else. But the way it's framed by the UK media, it immediately looks like you put all these tens of millions that disappeared and were murdered by the imperialist empires like UK or France or Belgium. You put these 10 millions on the same level as these 20 people who vanished because of the safety negligence of some Chinese mining company.
I mean, we've had an example here in the news just this week, which is a story about a so-called British jihadi who was released from Guantanamo Bay, apparently awarded a large sum in compensation for wrongfully imprisoning him there. And then we were told yesterday on all of the main channels that he has become a suicide bomber. He's blown himself up, and the only evidence that was actually presented was a picture of a puff of smoke on the other side of a hill. You couldn't even see him anywhere around. And this is all being rolled out through something called SITE, SITE, the Search for International Terrorist Entities, which is based just around the corner from the NSA up in Bethesda, Maryland. It just seems amazing to me that this kind of event is put at the top of the bulletins as a piece of news when there's clearly actually no evidence. And not only if there was evidence, it's come apparently from ISIS, and yet ISIS is supposedly a credible source. So I just wonder how far is this propaganda going to go before people start saying, well, it's just rubbish, and stop watching?
Yeah, it actually sounds like this British comedy for lions, right? I mean, it's just absolutely unbelievable what the propaganda in the West is doing. I wrote several pieces lately, and actually I find the British propaganda much more violent and much more toxic than the North American
one.
Well,
why is that?
North American one is very primitive. I mean, it's just it's there. Everybody knows it's there, and it's so vulgar that there is. But British one is very dangerous. I mean, you have an empire which was running for centuries, half of the planet, and basically pacified the entire world, pacified in parentheses, and even convinced the nations that were raped and occupied by it, like India, that actually it was doing quite a good job. I mean, if you talk to Indians, Most of them, I speak there very often, and I work everywhere from Kashmir to Kerala, and many of them actually, not all of course, but many of them believe that British administration was quite cool, that it did some good things and bad things, but there is no feeling of outrage about what would happen. Or in Malaysia, also another colony of the UK. So I mean, it's incredible achievement to rape half of the world, to plunder half of the world, kill tens of millions of people, and then actually leave, still being involved somehow through the counseling and coaching other members of the empire like the United States, but actually to leave with the memories of the colonized and raped and destroyed people that you actually did quite a good job in some fields. It's quite an achievement.
What about, you mentioned that you've been writing this novel of yours. Am I right? It's called Aurora?
Aurora.
Yeah,
Aurora.
So what's the reason for... I mean, because most of your stuff is, I know, articles. You can find Andre Vltchek's articles all over the internet, actually, quite a lot, including your non-fiction books. But what made you decide to write this novel?
Well, I am actually a novelist who is so outraged about the state of the world that I'm writing a lot of non-fiction books and philosophical books and articles, essays, everything. But I always go back to fiction because and to filmmaking. But fiction is and to plays, theater plays are very important because there are some things you simply cannot express through non-fiction. And I really think that fiction is still one thing that can mobilize the people because you have to put your heart, you have to put emotions into your writing in order to really outrage people, because people are not outraged anymore by data, by information. So they need something more. Aurora is a relatively short novel. It's about 150 pages, and it is about the cultural imperialism and indoctrination of the countries outside of the Western realm sphere, which are until now bombarded and pacified and derailed from its natural path by the Western culture.
What about some of the characters in the novel then?
Yeah, there are two main characters. One is the head of the huge cultural institute, a European cultural institute, a German-speaking country, which I don't want to name it, but everybody obviously knows it. But I would probably have a lawsuit on my head if I would name the cultural institute of that German-speaking country. And the head of this institute is basically an agent. He's an intelligence agent, but he's also there in the huge Asian country, which again is most likely Indonesia, but I don't say the name of it. But he's basically, through grants and funding, he's helping to pacify and indoctrinate young artists. But they also do much more horrible things. I mean, they still kidnap, they still torture, they still rape, as was done before. So I'm actually putting the culture, the Western culture and European culture in particular, and the crimes against humanity together. And it's a very strange, it's a conceptually very complex book, because there is a Mozart who appears. He's very angry about the whole thing because they also kind of raped him in old Vienna, and they never let him create. And he is sitting in some pub in a Chilean port city of Valparaiso together with Bertolt Brecht. And they're telling the story exactly of this German cultural attaché in Indonesia. And Aurora, who is a girl who is a very talented Indonesian painter who managed to escape Indonesia in the past and married a very famous communist progressive painter from Venezuela, with whom with her husband, she comes back, and there she confronts this German cultural attaché. So it's actually a dialogue in an old former capital of that country between these two people. I mean, and it's a dialogue between the left, between actually Latin American left, because this girl, although she's Indonesian, she adopted the ideas of Latin American revolution, and between this cultural establishment of Europe. It's very powerful. It's very humorous, actually. It's a funny book. But I wanted people to think about, because, we talk about culture all the time, about especially in Europe, culture is being glorified and put on the pedestal. But if you look closely what it really is, it's just centuries very often of absolute prostitution in classical music, in painting. I mean, you go to Louvre, you go to British Museum. It's not British Museum so much, but to National Gallery, and it's outrageous what you see. It's basically painters and musicians serving the cardinals and aristocracy and kings and everyone, just in exchange for some kind of recognition and comfortable life. There is absolutely no, you go to Louvre, right? I mean, you're in a second after UK, biggest country, biggest colonizing empire that was destroying countries and nations all over the world. And you don't see almost any rebellion of the artists against the colonialism. There is nothing about the suffering of people all over the world. So the culture, the European art and culture, is tremendously cowardly historically, and I'm addressing this issue as well.
I think
you cannot even compare it to like what is happening now in China or in Latin America. They criticize China for not being free. You go to 798, this huge city of art galleries in Beijing. They criticize everything from environment to capitalism to the Chinese socialism to everything. I mean, everything is political, and art participates in all this. You go in Paris, you see like poodles on the, you see like silver poodles on the bronze leash, and you see half-naked Japanese women and photographs exhibited in galleries. There is nothing. There is almost nothing daring, nothing provocative, nothing is, reality is not reflected in the Western art.
You're talking here in Bristol, and Bristol was a great centre of the slave trade for about 200 years. Amazing that there is no real cultural institute here in Bristol which talks about that. I mean, we had the Empire and Commonwealth Museum, which had a pretty excellent exhibition, I think it would be around about 2008, on the slave trade, which was a warts and all, look at it all. And what happened? Well, the funding got pulled and the museum closed.
Yeah, but this is actually, this is we are talking about, there is nothing anymore internationalist in the European art, but the art is so cowardly in Europe that it doesn't even reflect, it doesn't even deal with the problems that their own people are having. I mean, look, after what happened in the UK with Brexit, after what you see all over Europe, where the right-wing governments are being elected, people are depressed. You just see them being depressed in Paris, in Germany, in Czech Republic. They're really lost. They don't know what to do. And this is exactly the time when the artists should be reacting. I mean, there should be films. There is nothing even about, if you look at the Thatcher's era, I mean, there was a great cinema. There was a great British New Wave. There were films like Letter to Brezhnev, High Hopes, Sammy and Rosie Get Late. You cannot buy these films even online. I mean, you can probably, but it's very difficult. I was searching for them the other day, and even these films are forgotten. And it's like a good old Labour, speaking in that period of time. And it's not so long, it's not such a long time ago. And all this is gone in continental Europe. It's gone in UK. I just see art and as a very toothless and embarrassing kind of thing.
So are you suggesting we need some kind of cultural revolution?
No, of course. And it's also, they should go and learn something, for heaven's sake, instead of putting their defunct art and culture on the pedestal. They should go to China. They should go to Latin America. They should go even to South Africa and learn something, because there is still tremendous creativity. in all these parts of the world, and people are alive. They're fighting for something. They're not always succeeding. It's sometimes 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but they are fighting. You go to South Africa, there really is tremendous fight for improving the country. You go to China, it's a enormous fight in what direction the country will go. Not to speak about Latin America. I mean, every little town in South America, in places like Ecuador or Venezuela, the ideas are being ventilated. The ideas are being discussed. There are clashes. People demonstrate against each other. People fight on the stage. You can have a fist fight even, during the art openings. I once encountered it in Maracaibo, in the second city in Venezuela. And that's correct. That's how it should be. I mean, people are passionate about changing the society, but in Europe it's totally lobotomized.
Well, there seems to be very little passion and BBC drama, that's for sure, and I think that's what you're aiming at. Anyway, you also penned an article recently on Counterpunch, The West is Finished. What did you mean the West is finished? I mean, are you talking in a cultural sense or what?
In a cultural sense, but also it's quite complex. It's a philosophical article, so listeners should read it. It's very difficult to actually summarize it. But what I'm saying is that there was this entire obsession with science and knowledge and facts and all this actually created pseudo understanding of science, pseudo perceptions of reality and all that. And in the meantime, people lost the ability to feel, to emotionally, live in these countries. And they cannot, that's one of the reasons why they cannot create. And that's why they cannot anymore rebel. They cannot commit to anything. They make these premarital agreements. They meet each other. Before they even decide to be together, they kick each other, like test drive each other like a car to see if they fit or anything. There is nothing. There is no daring in relationships. There is no daring in. But the same thing is with revolution or with any change. I mean, you have to commit yourself. You really have to single-mindedly sometimes bulldozer things and believe in things, but they cannot believe anymore in anything. Everything is being questioned, everything is being rationalized. At the end, everybody ends up on the couch shouting at television sets, and nobody wants to be labeled. Nobody wants to put, if you are a Marxist, if you are a communist, you are ashamed almost to put labels on your head, because God forbid, people can think you are a total moron or you are too naive, or, it's just totally outdated. So everybody is very cool, but at the end, everything is empty and nothing is. Almost nobody is committed to anything. But it's very complex essay I wrote. It's quite long. It's like
anyway. I mean, I'll put a link to that article on our show page at www.dialectradio.co.uk. Also, because you're Russian particularly, I'd just like to get your take on Putin and the United Russia Party and how you think they're doing, because he does seem to have a tremendous amount of support. If you compare him to a lot of the Western leaders whose support is very fragile, like Theresa May, for example. And, I mean, whether you think that this is allowing a kind of bit more of a cultural freedom and a renaissance over in Russia?
Yeah, well, Tony, first of all, when I say that I'm Russian, honestly speaking, I mean, it's kind of my rebellion. I used to, if you would ask me 5 years ago, I would hesitate. I would say, yeah, I'm a U.S. citizen. I was educated in New York. I was born in Russia. I grew up in Czech Republic. I have Chinese blood in me and all this. I wouldn't know what to answer. And now with this combat and this propaganda against Russia, I just say I'm Russian. It's also, in a way, my provocation. It's my way of showing the finger to the empire, And especially here, like in the Middle East, it's great. I go to the barber and say, "Where are you from?" I say, "I'm Russian." They come and they give me a hug and they almost cry and say, "Thank you." I mean, okay, great. But about Putin, it's complicated. Look, I worked in Russia several times recently. I was in Moscow a few months ago, and I was in the Far East, and that was actually much more interesting than Moscow. I was in Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, and even in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, all the way in Kamchatka. One thing that is surprising is that people really do support the government, and I would say, like in the Far East at least, I would say maybe more than 80% do, and very sincerely. And it's interesting why. You ask them why, and they would tell you two things. First of all, of course, after this horror of Yeltsin and nitwit Gorbachev period, when country totally collapsed and you had scientists selling their libraries in a bitter cold in underpasses of Novosibirsk and Moscow, and old people didn't get paid, they didn't get their retirement plan and pensions. It was just total horror. So things, of course, improved. You go to every regional capital, it is a nice airport, it is a public hospitals, public schools, salaries are paid and all that. So this improved, but that's not really the only reason why they support Putin. And I would say this is very similar to China. And this is what the West doesn't realize. If you talk to Chinese or if you talk to Russians and you ask them about the situation, the global situation now, and this horrible attacks that both countries are facing, I think both nations had enough. And they will tell you, look, we are sending our messages to the government. Don't let the West get away with this anymore. Both countries were attacked, destroyed horribly. China by Brits and French and others by Americans, Russia, Soviet Union, Russia, of course, on many occasions. And people had enough. They do understand the vileness and toxic impact of the Western imperialism, and that they are again pushing to something absolutely horrific. And these two governments, because China has a so-called heavenly mandate, right? I mean, no matter what government is in power, it's running on the borrowed time. I mean, if the nation doesn't want this government to be in power, it will kick it out. And that was for thousands of years, and it didn't change. I mean, the Communist Party of China is afraid of its own people, and that's nice, because when people wanted Deng Xiaoping to make capitalist reforms, Deng Xiaoping did it. And now when President Xi wants to go back to socialism, he wants to go back to socialism because of the pressure that comes from the Chinese voters. So they both listen, and Putin too. They know that Russian people or Chinese people don't want this to be allowed anymore, to continue this absolute unbridled and open aggression that is coming from the West for centuries, but which again now is accelerating and which can totally destroy the world. So this is what you hear in the Far East of Russia too. They will tell you, look, there are some things we disagree with President Putin, but he helped our nation to rise from our knees. We are standing again. We are strong. We will never allow this, the horrors that we went through on so many occasions in history to repeat themselves. So that's what the main reason is. Socially, things improved. I think the country is governed in a decent way, not really in the perfect way. Nothing is perfect, and I don't know really how to label it, because I'm from the left. I wish I could call Russia a socialist country. I don't know whether it is. I mean, for me, always communism was a perpetual fight against Western imperialism. Socialist economically, maybe not. It's a mixed economy. Is it socialist in a social sphere? Well, it's maybe social democratic, and hopefully it's moving into the left. But definitely, its foreign policy is now they adopted the foreign policy of the Soviet Union in a good way, I think. Okay, now look, you mentioned there the Russia being on its knees in the early 1990s. One of the things that's just been going around as I don't know if it's a rumour, there certainly is some evidence for it, that because the Red Army hadn't been paid, that some of the Russian nuclear weapons were actually for sale on the black market. Now, that doesn't sound unfeasible. I wonder if you have any lines into that particular one, because it doesn't sound impossible, and yet it would be quite
dangerous if, for several years in the early 90s that this kind of stuff was peddled. I mean, these soldiers hadn't been paid for months, years, and they were looking for a bit of cash just to feed their families.
Well, yes, it was happening, and I know about it because I was working in places like Tomsk and Novosibirsk at the time, and it wasn't only the army. I mean, you had entire institutes and entire plants in Siberia and elsewhere that were producing, nuclear materials, not weapons. I mean, forget about weapons. You don't need weapons, really. They were producing nuclear materials, and they were there, very badly protected. And it wasn't even that. That somebody would be selling them. It was just the country was in total disarray. It was totally collapsing, and it was they were just there, and the security was horrible, and just anybody could come and take them. Basically, it was on that level, and of course, corruption was huge. That was a period when there was this deal between Al Gore, and Chernomyrdin, and they actually even led the Americans to build some deterrence systems, walls and perimeters in these plants. That's how bad things were.
Now, also, we've seen recently, end of last year, John Pilger's latest film, The Coming War on China. I wonder if you've seen it and whether you think...
Yeah, John sent me the link, yes.
So, I mean, I wonder what you make of that, because it does seem to put together a pretty strong case that the US is relentlessly, bit by bit, preparing. I mean, they're surrounding China in a similar way to they've done with Iran, for example, and Russia, and simply preparing for war. I mean, there's some amazing scenes in it where you've got US forces personnel living cheek by jowl with extreme poverty of the islanders in the Indian Ocean, etc. So, I mean, this is our South China Sea. So, you've got a potential conflict which is brewing, particularly with Trump starting to make some very insulting noises about China.
Look, I mean, I agree with John fully about that, and I'm writing about it a lot lately. But we disagree, of course, on some things that he made in this film, particularly about Chinese capitalism and all that. I still consider China a socialist country, and I have many reasons for believing that it is, and or knowing that it is. But I think John adopted a little bit stereotypical Western approach about China. It is not capitalist country. It's a very successful socialist country, Chinese way. About the Marshall Islands, I actually helped John to get some contacts there, because I wrote a whole book called Oceania, and I was working there. I know all about Marshall Islands and Ewai and the Kwajalein Atoll. It's a horrific stuff. That's where the U.S. is shooting its ballistic missiles from California and performing tests, and the missiles are falling to the most beautiful and the biggest atoll in the Pacific Ocean. Anyway, but it is very dangerous. I work in this field a lot because I work with China Academy of Social Sciences. I go to China very often, but I also work a lot in Philippines and in Vietnam. So I see how the West is provoking Asian countries against China. And look, I have testimonies even of Philippine academics, top intellectuals who just say, look, I mean, Philippines has no historic claim on the disputed areas in South China Sea, and it's actually the government was pushed to play this game and to provoke China. So notice now when President Duterte is in power, how violent and toxic hate propaganda against him was launched in both Europe and the United States, all about the killings of in this drug war and all this. It's all about China, because Duterte refused to play this game. He threatened to kick out Americans. He's making peace with China very quickly, and he called China the kindest nation on earth. And he met Putin, his hero. So I mean, notice this, and it goes like absolute avalanche and explosion of anti-Duterte propaganda, and of course funding of NGOs in Philippines that are trying to oust them. Exactly the same scenario that you have in Latin America, because actually the country is and was the most important part of anti-Chinese coalition, but it is also a country which lost 1 million people during the U.S. massacres at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's a very important country.
Andre, I wonder if you could just run us through titles of some of your books and your latest novel. Just remind us of that. Okay,
so the book is called Aurora, and that's the novel that we mentioned. And my huge and quite well, I don't want to say best-selling, but well-selling nonfiction book of 840 pages is called Exposing Lies of the Empire. And Exposing Lies of the Empire is a medley of mosaic of my reports and essays that I wrote all over the world, where I try to detect how the Western Empire is destroying everything that is standing on its way, and also how the people are resisting. And it is non-fiction, but it has some elements of fiction, because not fiction, but I'm using dialogues, I'm using humor, vulgarities, everything, because I believe that even in non-fiction and even in philosophy, we have to put some feelings into the writing, so people don't die from boredom when they just read naked facts.
Andre Vltchek, thanks very much for joining us on Dialect.
Tony, pleasure, and we'll speak soon again.
Yeah.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.